What does a 79-year-old rancher in South Texas, who has been running hogs on the same property since 1968, know that the rest of us are still trying to figure out? In my case, the answer turned out to be a two-feeder system that produced 23 dead hogs in a single night on a property where I had been killing 2 or 3 per visit and feeling good about it. I met Otis Barfield on a lease adjacent to his in Webb County, brush country down near the Nueces River, where he runs cattle and has been managing hogs on the same 7,000 acres for over 50 years. He watched me describe my setup to a buddy and said nothing for about 3 minutes. Then he asked me how many feeders I was running, and when I said 1, he just nodded and invited me out the following week. The night after he showed me his system, I shot 9 hogs off a second feeder, while 14 more were in a corral trap between the 2 feeders. I want to walk you through exactly what he built and why it works, because the principle behind it changes how you think about trap placement at the most fundamental level. There is also a modification he makes to the pre-baiting schedule that cuts the time to first trap capture in half, and I will cover that near the end. You have probably had this experience or something close to it. You get camera confirmation of a sounder hitting a feeder at dusk, consistent for 2 weeks. You set the trap, and the first 2 capture events are 3 animals and 4 animals. You check the camera and see that on the nights you captured, 10 or 12 hogs showed up, but only 3 or 4 ever fully committed to the trap. The rest circled, checked the entrance, and left. You adjust the gate height, change the bait, try a different trigger, and the pattern continues. 3 or 4 animals per event while you watch 8 to 12 show up on camera and choose not to enter. That gap between what the camera shows and what the trap catches is the cautious approach problem at a feeder location, and no amount of trap adjustment fixes it because the problem is not mechanical, it is behavioral. Most hog trappers, including me for about 6 years, position the corral trap at the feeder. The logic seems obvious. The hogs are coming to the feeder, so trap them where they are. Otis's first question to me was whether I had noticed that the hogs were most cautious exactly at the feeder location. Of course I had. Every experienced hog hunter knows that the most educated animals will circle a feeder for 30 minutes before committing, if they commit at all. What Otis understood that I did not was that the cautious behavior is specific to the feeder location, because that is where the threat history lives. Every shot fired, every human intrusion, every camera check near a feeder deposits a negative event in the threat memory of that sounder at that specific spot. The feeder is the most dangerous place on your property from the hog's perspective, even when it is producing results. Positioning a trap there means you are trying to capture the most behaviorally conditioned, cautious animals at the exact location where they are most suspicious. Before I describe the setup, I want to say something about the knowledge transfer problem in hog hunting that this conversation with Otis illustrated. Most of the practical hog management knowledge that has been developed on private land in the South over the last 50 years lives in the heads of people like him, ranchers who have been dealing with this problem since before any of the commercial solutions existed, and who figured things out by observation and necessity rather than by reading a forum post. That knowledge does not automatically transfer to the next generation of hunters because the people who have it are not making YouTube videos, and they often do not think of what they know as anything unusual. Otis genuinely did not understand why I was treating his 2-feeder system like a revelation. He said he thought everyone ran it this way. They do not. Most of us are still running single-feeder setups that we learned from someone who also ran single-feeder setups. And the knowledge base has not improved because nobody asked the right questions to the right people. I got lucky that I happened to be standing next to him when I described my setup out loud. His solution is to separate the trap from both feeders entirely. You run 2 feeders positioned roughly 150 to 200 yards apart, which is about the distance between the 2 end zones on a football field, along a known travel corridor between a bedding area and a water or food source. Both feeders pre-bait for a minimum of 3 weeks, with 0 human presence at either location. During that 3-week period, the sounder develops a reliable circuit between the 2 feeders, moving from one to the other in the same general direction on the same approximate schedule. You let them run that circuit until it is as predictable as a bus route. Then you position the corral trap, a large panel trap that can capture an entire sounder at once, centered between the 2 feeders, roughly 60 to 80 yards from each one, directly on the path between them. When the sounder is moving from feeder 1 to feeder 2 along their established route, they walk into the trap in transit rather than at a feeding site. They are not cautious the same way at a travel corridor that has no threat history. They are moving with purpose, focused on the food source ahead, and the trap intercepts them before the threat association of the feeder site can trigger their caution behavior. My wife heard me describe this conversation on the phone with my buddy that same evening, after I left Otis's property. She waited until I had finished, and then asked why I was describing a trapping setup I had just learned from a 79-year-old, as if I had invented it myself. She had a point. I am not sure why explaining something you just learned feels better if you omit the part where someone older and smarter told you. I have tried to describe Otis's setup accurately every time since. Let me be direct about the sample size on this before anyone asks. I have run Otis's setup on 3 properties over 2 full seasons since he showed it to me. On 2 of those 3 properties, the first trap event captured a sounder of more than 10 animals. On the 3rd property, it captured 7. For context, my standard single feeder corral setups over the same period average 3 to 4 animals per capture event. I am not presenting that as a controlled study. Different properties, different pressure levels, different sounder sizes, weather patterns I cannot control. But the directional result across 3 properties in 2 seasons was consistent enough that I have abandoned the single feeder trap placement on every property where I have room to run 2 feeders, which is most of them. There are specific requirements for this to work, and I want to be precise about them. The 2 feeders need to be positioned so that the travel line between them passes through an area with enough cover that the sounder feels comfortable moving through it during daylight-adjacent hours. An open field between 2 feeders on flat ground does not produce the same result as a travel corridor that has brush or tree line cover on both sides. Otis's Webb County property has mesquite brush corridors between the feeders that provide the cover hogs want during the transition period from bedding to feeding. On my Drew County, Arkansas setup in river bottom hardwoods, the feeder corridor runs through a creek bottom with timber on both sides, and the sounder uses it like a highway. On my Leaflore County, Oklahoma property, where the terrain is more open, the setup produced worse results until I repositioned the feeders to use a fence line with brush growth as the connecting corridor. The cover is the pathway. Without it, the sounder may not reliably move between the 2 feeders in a way that runs through your trap position. The corral trap itself matters significantly. Otis runs panels at least 16 feet in diameter, which is roughly the footprint of a large round cattle pen, or about the width of a 2-car garage with room to spare. Smaller traps miss animals on the edges when the sounder spreads out during transit. The gate needs to be a gravity drop or a remote trigger design, because a rooter gate that opens both ways will get pushed open by the last animal in the group. He uses a remote cellular trigger that lets him watch the camera feed and drop the gate from his phone when the entire sounder is inside. That cellular trigger costs less than $50 online, and it is the single highest value component of the whole setup. Without remote trigger control, you are relying on a mechanical trigger that fires when the first animal crosses it, which often captures only part of the sounder because the rest have not entered yet. With the remote trigger, you wait until you can see every animal in the frame and then close it. That patience, waiting for the last stragglers to commit before you drop the gate, is what converts a 3-animal capture into a 14-animal capture. Before you start, check your state regulations on trapping. Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas, South Carolina, Oklahoma. Most of these states allow corral trapping on private land, with no restrictions. Some states require registration of large traps, or have restrictions on how captured animals are handled or dispatched. The answer for your county takes 10 minutes to find and is worth finding before you build anything. If you are getting value from this, hit subscribe. More of these coming. One thing worth saying about the size of sounder you can expect to capture with this setup versus a standard single feeder trap. Standard corral traps at single feeders on pressured properties average 3 to 5 animals per capture event. In my experience and in most forum discussions I have seen on the topic, the cautious approach behavior limits how many animals commit before the gate drops or before the mechanical trigger fires. Otis's average across 5 years of documented captures on his Webb County property was 11 animals per event. He showed me the notebook. He has been logging capture counts since 1973, originally by species, then adding capture method when he started using corral traps in the early 1990s. The documentation quality is not what you would get from a research institution, but 50 years of consistent observation from the same man on the same property is a data set worth respecting. The pattern it shows is clear. Corridor capture events are roughly 3 times larger than feeder capture events on the same property, using the same trap. The pre-baiting schedule modification Otis makes to accelerate the first trap capture is something I have never seen written down anywhere, and I looked after he described it. Standard pre-baiting advice tells you to run bait for a week to 2 weeks before you set the gate. Otis runs both feeders for 3 weeks without touching the trap. Then on the night before he activates the trap, he shuts off feeder 1 completely. He lets it run dry or manually empties it. Feeder 2 continues running normally. The sounder that has been circuiting between the 2 feeders for 3 weeks arrives at feeder 1 on night 22 or 23 and finds it empty. Their established pattern now has no food reward at that stop. Feeder 2, positioned at the other end of the corridor, is still running. The sounder crosses the corridor toward feeder 2, moving with more urgency than they typically would because the first stop produced nothing, and they hit the trap location at higher speed and with less caution because they are motivated rather than leisurely browsing. First trap capture on this modification averaged about 2 nights after feeder 1 was shut off on the 3 properties where I ran it. On the standard pre-baiting schedule without the feeder shutdown, my first captures had been averaging 6 to 7 days after gate activation. I cannot explain the mechanism with complete confidence. My best guess is that the shutdown triggers enough urgency in the sounder's movement that they pass through the trap zone before the dominant sow has time to engage her standard threat assessment behavior at that location. Otis just said they get hungry and stop being careful. He may be right. He has killed more hogs than I have, which is saying something. The 23 hogs from that first night with Otis's system broke down as follows. 14 were in the corral trap when the gate dropped at 9:47 p.m., captured on the transit between feeder 1, which he had shut off 2 days earlier, and feeder 2. A second sounder had been working feeder 2 from the opposite approach direction, which I had not known was happening because I was focused on the first group. I was positioned 30 yards downwind of feeder 2, roughly the distance from the pitcher's mound to the outfield grass in a standard stadium, and that second sounder came in over the next 2 hours as the first group was contained in the trap. 9 animals from that second group. You can raise legitimate questions about whether that second sounder situation is replicable or whether it was a coincidence of 2 sounders using the same property that night. My answer is that I would not have been in position to take advantage of it without Otis's system, because without feeder 2, I had no reason to be sitting in that location. The 2-feeder design naturally creates a second observation and shooting position that did not exist in my single feeder setup. Before getting to failure modes, a note on where this setup does not work, regardless of how well you execute it. On properties under about 150 acres, roughly the size of a standard quarter section at just over half, you may not have room to position 2 feeders with 150 yards of corridor between them without those feeders being too close to the property boundary or existing pressure points. Otis's property is large enough that neither feeder creates noise or scent intrusion problems with adjacent areas. On a small lease where the 2 feeders would need to be placed near a road, a neighboring residence, or a heavily hunted area on the other side of the fence, the baseline pressure from those adjacent disturbances may undermine the neutral corridor behavior you are trying to create. Small properties are where you go to a single well-positioned corral trap with extended pre-baiting not to the 2-feeder corridor system. This is a setup for ground with room on it. 2 things that go wrong with this setup when hunters try it for the first time. The first is impatience with the 3-week pre-bait window. Most hunters activate the trap after 10 days because they are seeing consistent camera activity and want to make a move. Otis's reasoning on 3 weeks is that the sounder needs enough circuit repetitions, that the travel path between the feeders is established well enough to survive the stress of the feeder 1 shutdown. With 10 days of circuit behavior, the shutdown may cause them to abandon the route entirely, rather than push harder to feeder 2. With 3 weeks, the route is conditioned enough that the feeder 2 pull overrides the disruption. I broke this rule on my first attempt, activated at 12 days, and the sounder disappeared from the property for 8 days after feeder 1 went dark. Came back eventually, but I had lost momentum and had to restart the pre-bait window. Otis was patient about it when I told him. He said something about how the first 10 years you miss a lot of hogs, and the next 40 you stop doing it wrong. I should add a self-correction to the first failure mode description. I said I activated at 12 days, and the sounder disappeared for 8 days. The full truth is that I also walked to feeder 1 to check whether the corn was actually empty, because I did not fully trust the camera angle, and that foot visit left human scent at the exact spot I needed to be clean for the feeder shutdown motivation to work correctly. The sounder disappearing for 8 days was probably at least partly my fault for contaminating the site. When I ran the feeder shutdown modification correctly on subsequent properties, with no foot visits to either feeder after the shutdown, the sounder committed to the corridor within 2 nights consistently. The lesson is not just to wait 3 weeks before gate activation. It is to not touch either feeder after the shutdown event. Let the camera tell you what you need to know, and keep your feet out of it. The second failure mode is setting the trap too close to one of the feeders. The instinct is to put it near feeder 2, the active one, reasoning that the sounder is moving toward a food source and the trap should be close to the food. Otis specifically places his trap at the midpoint of the corridor rather than near either feeder. For the reason I described earlier, the feeder locations carry threat history, and the closer the trap gets to either feeder, the more that threat history bleeds into the trap location's behavioral profile. The midpoint of the corridor is neutral ground. Place the trap within 50 yards, roughly half the length of a standard bowling lane, of either feeder, and you are back in the cautious approach zone that makes single feeder trapping produce small capture events. Midpoint, or as close to midpoint as the terrain allows. I want to add one more thing about how Otis thinks about hog management that does not fit neatly into the setup description, but that changed how I approach every property I run. He said something on that first evening, looking at his camera data from decades of running the same ground, that I have thought about many times since. He said most hunters are trying to catch the hogs that are already at the feeder. He was trying to catch hogs that had not reached the feeder yet. The feeder is a destination that has been influenced by every negative event that has happened there. A travel corridor between 2 feeders is neutral. It has no history. The hog moving through it is in transit mode, not threat assessment mode. And the difference in their behavior at those 2 moments is the difference between an animal that circles for 40 minutes and one that walks through in 2. I think that principle applies beyond the 2 feeder setup. Anytime you can intercept hogs at a neutral location rather than meeting them at a location that has pressure history, your capture and kill efficiency goes up. A saddle crossing between a bedding area and a feeder is a neutral location. A creek crossing on an established travel route is neutral. A fence gap that every sounder on the property uses because it is the only way through is neutral. The feeder is where the hog is expected. Everywhere else is where the hog is caught off guard. On a Texas hunting forum thread from a few years ago, a rancher running properties in Zavala County documented his version of a similar 2-feeder system with slightly different geometry and posted kill counts across 3 seasons. His average capture per trap event on the corridor setup was 9.3 animals. His historical average on single-feeder trap setups before switching was 3.1. Same properties, same sounder population, different trap placement philosophy. He credited a neighbor in his 80s who had been running hogs before modern commercial traps existed, which is a pattern I have heard from enough experienced hog hunters now that I think there is a real knowledge transfer happening when older ranchers who develop these methods from scratch share them with people willing to listen. The thing about Otis is that he does not hunt hogs for sport. He manages them because they are destroying his root structure on rangeland he has been building for 50 years, and because he has watched the population double every few years, regardless of what he does. He has thought about this problem at a level of depth that someone who hunts them recreationally every few weekends never has to. He is not trying to kill 23 hogs to have a story. He is trying to knock the population back enough to protect his cattle operation, and that pressure produces a completely different quality of problem solving than recreational hunting does. The 2-feeder system is not clever for its own sake. It is the result of 50 years of running setups, watching what worked and what failed, and paying attention to why. A GON forum thread from a few years ago documented a version of this setup run by a group of hunters on a Colleton County, South Carolina property. They posted their results across 2 trap seasons, Standard single feeder placement in Season 1. Corridor placement based on a similar 2-feeder approach in Season 2. Their Season 1 average was 4 animals per capture event across 11 trap events. Their Season 2 average was 8.5 animals per event across 9 events. Same property, same general sounder population, same trap hardware. The only variable was placement philosophy. Their thread is worth finding if you want to see someone else's documentation of this, beyond what I am telling you. I will say that their property's terrain was different from Webb County brush country and different from my Drew County river bottom, and the setup still performed consistently. The principle seems to transfer across terrain types as long as the corridor cover requirement is met. Build it once on a property with at least 300 acres, roughly the area of a standard square mile section at about half size, so you have room to position 2 feeders with a 150-yard corridor between them. Run it for 3 weeks. Shut off feeder 1 on night 22. Activate the remote trigger and watch the camera feed. On a property with active sounder movement, that first trap event will tell you very quickly whether the setup is producing what the old man said it would. My experience across 3 properties says it will. His experience across 50 years says the same.